was we were in Germany. We were looking at the city of Berlin and looking at how the particular atmosphere in Berlin post-war led to a style of architecture and art that was called Expressionism, where this very idea was that artists and architects, through their work, can express deeper instincts of human feeling and emotion that can then be expressed within the work itself. Now, as you can imagine, there was another movement that was in many ways antithetical or opposed to this idea of expression. And that is what we are calling the new objectivity. And what we'll be looking at is some of the architects actually who emerged out of the new objectivity movements, which ended up becoming one of the most important, I think, architectural movements for the past 100 years, the Bauhaus. So that's what today is going to be. And what we are going to do is that we're going to really look a little closely at the history of the Bauhaus and look at the four different stages that it went through before it eventually shut down. Hmm? The reason why we'll spend a little time on it is because I think each of those phases affected architectural thinking and architectural thought, including the courses that we designed within architecture schools in profound ways that we actually are only beginning to kind of come to terms with. So I'm just going to share the screen. Can you guys see the screen or?
Now we can, yes.
Now you can, right?
Yeah.
So it's called, this today's lecture is called New Objectivity Bauhaus, and I've chosen a blue for the title card just because I felt like, something about rationality meant blue from last week's expressionist lecture. And to start off the lecture, let's revisit these figures that we left of the late 19th century. The dandy and the flaneur. We spoke about them last time as well, before we arrived upon the character of the romantic, if you guys remember. But again, back to the dandy who saw the world as artifice. This is, of course, the Gustav Klimt Fries from the Secession Building, and the flaneur who's literally walking around the city and in many ways receiving the city as literally like a kind of work of art. That's like drifting along, taking in the city. There is this character whom I think is an interesting one, because in this character there is a sense of detachment from what is being seen and the person watching. So there's a kind of coldness that is imagined, that this person is not involved. His expressions within are not coming through. There's an impression of what is being seen. That, of course, leads to the famous movement of Impressionism, where the entire emphasis is on trying to understand the nature of light. It's almost an analytical movement that is taking a work, trying to analyze the mode in which the nature of light itself. What are the colors within a color? That leads to kinds of post-impressionist imaginations, like I guess movements called pointillism, where entire paintings are made out of dots, each color representing a different pigment almost, and looking at how these different pigments come together to form the larger work, as it were. Later on, the work gets even more abstracted. This is a movement that's called the Fauvists, where the pixels are becoming harder and more kind of thing, until it's almost disintegrating into mere pixels. The entire surface is just becoming simplifications of form. That's what you're largely seeing in these spaces. You also have movements like this, which is the Cubists. And what's interesting about the Cubists, and this is of course Pablo Picasso's famous Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I don't know how to pronounce that, but regardless. Where there is this way in which the world is now being kind of turned into pure planes, where we are taking a surface and we are constantly turning it up and down to kind of reveal all the facets of a particular object, as it were. Like this, for example, is Man with a Guitar by Georges Braque, where the man and the figure of the man is completely abstracted, as it were, into pure planes, and these planes are then composed with each other to kind of be able to reveal the entirety of the man with a guitar. Another famous painting of that time is The Nude Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp, where Similar to the famous sort of futurist movements, there is a way in which the movement of a woman who's descending down the stair is trying to be analyzed. But unlike the futurists, who are trying to in many ways capture the reality of that movement, with Marcel Duchamp, here you're seeing that there's an abstraction until it becomes purely an analytical act of trying to figure out exactly what happens to the body as it's coming down the stairs. So let's now look at the let's kind of go back to the historical chart that we've been playing with. This is the period that is from the 1900s to the 1950s. We'll be returning to this very often. And just to kind of like carefully take you through all of the stuff that's at the base, the Annie Besant becomes the head of the Theosophical Society. If you remember, we'll be returning to Annie Besant a little later on. The Futurist Manifesto is being written in 1909. 1910 is Adolf Loos's famous essay, Ornament is Crime. Right? The De Stijl movement that we saw in Amsterdam is actually the manifesto is written in 1917. Okay. This is that famous exhibition where a lot of these different movements actually come together. If you remember Bruno Taut's work as well, is the Stuttgart exhibition of the Weissenhof estates, where they put together buildings that in many ways represented what was meant to be the modern architecture. And that, of course, is happening right in the middle of this entire yellow period. The yellow period is what we are calling the Weimar Republic. It lasts from the end of the war, 1918, till 1933, when Hitler comes to power in Germany. After which there's a gradual decline in almost everything until everything disintegrates, actually. What you're seeing here below are two important things. There's the Deutsche Werkbund, and which actually starts in 1907 and continues all the way up to 1939 until, of course, with Hitler in power, it again gets dismantled. And you have SIAM. SIAM is this famous modernist movement that we will see in 2 weeks in terms of what these are. Just to let you know that all of these things are happening. It is in this period that you have this movement, which is, of course, the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus, it's actually, considering the amount of influence it had, it actually lasted a very short period of time, surprisingly short. But in spite of its very short life, it has been one of the most important movements within architecture, and we shall see why as we go a little further. But first, let's just very quickly talk about the Deutsche Werkbund. So the Deutsche Werkbund it was a collective of German craftsmen, artists, and architects that was state-sponsored. It was imagined as a place, as a group that would in many ways sponsor works that would allow German industry to participate in the modern city building or modern kinds of movements as such, create products, create architectures that would really bring Germany into the modern world. And there is a different history as far as that is concerned. There are lots of really interesting people worked within it. It started with an Art Deco movement and then moved gently into a very, very kind of strong modernist sort of slant. One of the important people who started the movement was this man, man called Peter Behrens. Peter Behrens was one of the most important architects in Germany of the early period. Okay, he died in 1940, so died in the middle of the war. What you have here, and he was involved with the setting up of the Deutsche Werkbund. These are some of his works. He, of course, also built a building in the 1927 Stuttgart exhibition. And if you remember, many of the groups, architectural groups that we had spoken of last time, the glass chain, the ring, Peter Behrens was very much a part of those. And what is really interesting about him is that in 1907 to 1910, in this short 3-year period, and I believe some of them even worked with each other or at the same time in his office, Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Mies van der Rohe, 3 of the biggest architects of the 20th century, all worked in his office. So his influence has been a great influence, but unfortunately, in most modern histories of architecture, besides a casual mention of him, there is not that much. Although the building that is really spoken of is this one in the beginning, which is the AEG turbine factory. We'll take a look at that building a little carefully. But Behrens was not only an architect for a particular kind of client. The client that he was worked very closely with was the AEG factories. So he designed all kinds of things for them, logos and light fittings, and including the building itself. This is the building in Berlin, is the AEG turbine factory. It's a very simple building, but it's a very and it's very beautiful actually when you see it in reality. It's just a long bar that runs all the way across, and there is a strong use of the curtain glazing. That is a really important thing for the project. You have to think about that it's being built in 1909 and 1908, right? So there's a huge curtain glazing that's held between these heavy kind of piers, brick piers. And you can see the fact that actually even them, all the surfaces are also really interesting. While this is slanting backwards, the pier, the big kind of space here is just kind of sitting on top of the glass surface itself, right? This is the interior of the building, a steel structure that holds up a skylight. I mean, sorry, a clear story and a skylight above with steel trusses. Just a large room with all the other kind of more, I mean, office spaces, etc., all tucked to the left, but the entire thing is built in steel, as you can see in this image of the building under construction. It is this kind of tectonic, of course, that becomes very influential in most of what 20th century architecture really thinks about when it thinks about what is the modern. And one of the people who's really most instrumental in that is this man called Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius he was, I mean, these are the buildings that we will be looking at to some extent, not all of them, uh, but literally almost a year after the Behrens factory is being built, Gropius builds, I think, one of the most important buildings of the 20th century, which is the Fagus factory. Okay. So the Fagus factory is actually this building. What's important about this building is the curtain glazing, is the way that light is brought into the interior. It's a very simple plan, a straightforward grid with office spaces that are kind of held within tight bars, but otherwise most of it is like just a large open space. There's another bar on the left that holds other functions, right? The building is brick, kind of brick surfaces, but what's interesting is the way that the glass doesn't end at the corner like it does in the Behrens factory. Here the glass begins to turn corners, it begins to float until the inside-outside relationships begin to dissolve. This entire place where you're able to see the detail, where you can see the brickwork and the glass cage with the stair that's kind of literally floating within. Different kinds of windows that happened on the surface of the building. So this then becomes a very interesting kind of idea of thinking about the building. When you think about the fact that literally almost the same year, the building that we saw last time, which is the sulfuric acid factory that by Hans Polzig, that famous expressionist architect, is also building his building. And here you seem to have two very divergent ideas for the architectural. One that emerges pretty much from the idea of in expressiveness, and the other one that really emerges from the idea of transparency and clarity. It really reminded me, while we were looking at this, of this famous essay or book by Nietzsche, which is called The Birth of Tragedy. And in The Birth of Tragedy, he really makes this sort of difference between what he calls the Apollonian spirit and the Dionysian spirit. Apollo, both of them, of course, being Greek gods. Apollo is like a god of kind of sun and light and clarity, in a sense that he's about order and logic and music and dance and everything that's beautiful and clean. While Dionysus is in many ways his opposite. He is the god of pleasure, of sexuality, of insanity, of fertility. So he's the place where all the base, quote unquote, base instincts of mankind exist. And a lot of kind of debate concerning, and what Nietzsche says is that there's always a tussle between these two tendencies within human beings. The Apollonian, which is the desire for light, and the Dionysian, which is the desire for darkness. And when you think about these two factories that were built literally almost, the same year, you see, for me, a sort of difference between those two. You're able to see the Apollonian imagination in Walter Gropius's Fagus factory, and you can see a Dionysian sort of love of darkness in Polzig's sulfuric acid factory. But what our friend Gropius really becomes most famous for is actually this this movement called the Bauhaus, which is done in which is something that he starts in 1919 and lasts up till 1933. Okay. What's interesting, I mean, this is something that I should have enlarged, but I didn't. But what's interesting for me is this building. You see this building here? This is a monument to the March Dead. I've increased it so you're able to see it. And you can see the fact that this is actually very, very expressionist in nature. It's very unlike the kind of cold clarity that we expect from Gropius, right? In 1921, Gropius is still in many ways trying to find his own mode of speaking as an architect. And when he's building a monument, he builds this dynamic movement that is shooting up into the sky. But the Bauhaus really kind of starts in 1919 in a town called Weimar, the same town that gives the Weimar Republic its name. Okay, it is imagined as a place where you would kind of train the new craftsmen, architects, artists of the modern era. It has a particular approach to design that wanted to do the strange mixture between two things. One was it was really interested in craftsmanship, in people making things with their hands. So there was an interest in craft. And on the other hand, and actually quite antithetically, it also had a real interest in mass production. So the idea was to be able to kind of take the advantages of mass production and be able to create aesthetic objects for the consumption of the general public in Germany and actually around the world. And this was really, I think, one of the primary tasks that most of the Bauhaus architects really took under that really wanted to kind of work with. Each of them, however, had a different way and a different approach or a different emphasis in that relationship. But the Bauhaus was really a place that became a kind of star-studded galaxy of people. As you can see, hardly any women except one, but it was a place that a lot of the important architects and artists from working in Germany, in Russia, and in Austria, all gravitated towards. It became a kind of place where all these ideas really became started working with each other. So what happens is that the first phase, so what we've done below is that we've divided the entire period of the Bauhaus from 1919 to 1933 within 4 phases, really. And what we'll do is that we'll be talking about each of the phases in separately, right? So the first phase is what is called the Expressionist phase. In this phase, actually, we have the Bauhaus really focusing upon the similar ideas as the Expressionists. The idea that the artist is in many ways in charge of kind of expressing his or her inner feelings within work itself. For example, this kind of cover of the Bauhaus Manifesto that was written in 1919 itself, right, for an exhibition called Exhibition of Unknown Architects. Gropius said in this essay that he wanted to create a new guild of craftsmen without the class distinction, which raise an arrogant barrier between a craftsman and an artist. So here you're immediately seeing the kind of difference, particularly within the Bauhaus, that says that art and craft are not separate things. Art and craft are the same thing. And this is the famous cover, which is a sort of by Lionel Feininger, which is called Cathedral, which is the cover of the manifesto. An important character in this phase, whom I have really only discovered very, very recently, which is really my bad, was this man called Johannes Itten. Now, Johannes Itten developed what was I think one of the most important contributions of the Bauhaus to architectural education around the world, is that he developed what was called the basic course in the Bauhaus. In the first years, there was something in the first year, what they had was a kind of basic course. In that, it was imagined that one can teach design through imparting basic skills to any student, and these basic design skills transcended whatever your medium might be, whether it was film or whether it was architecture or whether it was I don't know, ceramics. And there were some basic kind of design skills that were there, and that, you know, things like contrast and whatever, things like that. What's interesting is the way that Itten himself arrived into the Bauhaus. And here we need to go back to Madame Blavatsky, if you remember from last week. So Madame Blavatsky, of course, as you may remember, was this mystic. And then she started this movement called the Theosophists, which was highly influential in Europe. Annie Besant, like you heard, Annie Besant was also a theosophist, and she then, of course, goes ahead and starts the kind of Indian home rule movement with Tilak later on in her life. But what's interesting here is that this woman called Alma Mahler, okay, was also highly influenced by Annie Besant. Now, Alma Mahler itself seems to be a really interesting character for me. Alma Mahler was married to the composer Mahler, a really important composer from Vienna. I mean, incredible work being done. And as you guys know, Vienna itself was a hotbed of lots of really interesting things happening. It had that kinds of people. The Art Nouveau movement was happening. The Vienna Secession was happening. So there's a lot of turmoil in the air. And Alma Mahler was highly influenced by thought forms and by Annie Besant and converted into uh, and became a theosophist. Alma Mahler, however, then started having an affair with Walter Gropius, and whom she eventually married. She dumped her Mahler and then married Gropius. And because she married Gropius, she was very influential in who got to, and she really affected who came to teach in the first years of the Bauhaus. And Johannes Etienne was one of the important people that she then brought to teach at the Bauhaus, besides Vasily Kandinsky, the other expressionist painter that we met last week. Bat And both of these, of course, were highly influenced by this book that we saw last time as well, Thought Forms, Annie Besant. And these are some of the kinds of images that we saw last week, right? Of how color and ideas were supposed to be related to each other. So it was these ideas that Itten then brings into his course. And this is the way that he designs the course. This is the first year at the top, right? And what you imagine at the basic course, this is what Itten was in charge of, was that you study elementary studies of form, studies of materials in preliminary workshop. And then as you kind of go deeper and deeper into the center, it gets more and more complex. So you have the study of materials, nature studies at the second ring. Then you start looking at materials themselves. And then when you come to the center is where you actually have, where everything comes together, the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is actually architecture. Yeah. So this becomes a really interesting kind of diagram when we think about the way that even we are taught in school. I think many of you all must have gone to these courses, preliminary courses to what Nata classes and stuff like that. And what you very often find in these Nata classes is actually what Itten set up as the basic course of teaching. You might even recognize some of these sorts of kinds of diagrams, etc., that were done by you guys in your NATA courses and continue to be done in many basic design courses around the world, but doesn't happen at KRVIA anymore. But you have these sorts of abstracted imaginations of form and space that are then played with, right? You have color wheels and color stars that are part of that course. You have nature studies, looking at what is the form of nature and looking at the ways in which one can be able to capture every single part of it, looking at the form within. And of course, collages with different materials. All of these tools, which become so integral to our architectural training, are actually born within the Bauhaus at that particular period of time. Attempts to represent the progress of a feeling in line, such an expressionist imagination as you're seeing in these drawings itself. Look at this line. The jug was drawn with the ink brush in an uninterrupted stroke after the mental conception of what the shape had become clear, right? So these are all kinds of ideas that are part of the Bauhaus's early years. These are some collages that are made in this particular period. And you have, there's such an expressionist image. It almost could be from a film, no? From an expressionist film like we saw last time, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The picture conveys the stark horror of the sleepwalker, for example. You also have, the entire body was to be retrained to become an artist and architect. So theater exercises and theater and bodily movement, dance were also deeply incorporated within the basic course. One had to free one's body as much as one had to free one's mind. And it also set up the kind of jury system that we have, within architecture education, where students are critiqued in collectives by expert jurors who come and kind of pass comments on their work. So if you don't like juries, you can blame the Bauhaus. Yeah. So theater, like I said earlier, also became an important, but this is an important artist called Oscar Schlemmer, who kind of, they used to do these ballets and theatrical productions where everything was designed by the students, the sets, the costumes, the performance, the lighting. So there was a very much an idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art that was really going to be part of the Bauhaus's project. Like I said, expressionists like Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky were part of the main faculty at this time within the Bauhaus, and but also you had people coming from all over the world who also wanted to be part of Bauhaus. Some of them were actually a part of it, and some of them were just in the neighborhood. Like Theo van Doesburg never really officially joined the Bauhaus, but visited it and visited the neighborhood and was very influential. Lisitsky, whom we'll meet later on, comes from Russia to the Bauhaus. Yeah. It's in the second phase, really, that you have the idea of the new objectivity beginning to make its presence felt within the Bauhaus, and it happens after Joseph Itten leaves the Bauhaus, and a man called Laszlo Moholy-Nagy replaces Itten. But just as a matter of interest, this is also the year that the Bauhaus put up a very important exhibition in Calcutta. Because I think Tagore is the one who gets the Bauhaus to put together an exhibition in Calcutta, and I don't and so there is already a sort of international kind of network between the Bauhaus and Shantiniketan. Just another matter of interest is the Bauhaus and Shantiniketan's Kala Bhavan literally start in exactly the same year, and two very different imaginations of the modern are being born at the same time. Yeah. It is in this period that architecture, which was never really part of the curriculum, only becomes part of the curriculum in 1927. Okay, almost 7 years or 8 years after the course has actually completely begun. Uh, so let's look a little bit at the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. But let's look at this the constitution that was written at that time. To shape the intellectual crafts and technical abilities of creatively talented human beings, to equip them for design work, particularly construction, and to perform practical experiments, notably in housing construction and interiors, something that Itten and all are not particularly interested in. Now, suddenly, question of housing, industry, how does design connect with the real world? All of these things become important that were not really central, that I would say, in the expressionist phase of the school. Okay. This is Moholy-Nagy. This is Moholy-Nagy's sort of works, what he calls a light space modulator, where you have this object that is in many ways, casting shadows on the walls, and the interest is really in the forms that are being cast by shadows. Moholy-Nagy was a photographer, and these are some of his photographs. Right, this is Lucia Moholy in the 1920s, probably his wife. But also a photo montage. So look at this. Look at the way in which white space, dark space. Look at the composition itself of this image, right? Where the body and where the bodies of people are floating and caught between or playing with the hard geometries around them. Another image like that, you can these leaping women with these kind of cuboids and transparent planes around her body. Another one with this circle and kind of playful movements. It's as if the geometry itself becomes an object, like a toy, through which the new modern human being can really celebrate her own identity. I love these photographs that he takes of the famous Bauhaus building, where these bodies are literally caught up as little tiny figures against this stark black, white, and grey surfaces of the building. Leaping, playing with it literally like a piece of kind of like a toy. And of course, the drama of the horizon, the drama of the sky, where the building itself almost becomes the sky. These leaping men, playing freely in the park with the Bauhaus building in the background. And that is the building that we'll be seeing now, a building designed by Walter Gropius. Okay, that is become iconic of the Bauhaus movement around the world. Just a second, I just need to, yeah. This is the building itself as an aerial view. As you can see, it's a building that's actually has very discrete parts, 1, 2, 3 parts that are all then connected by like bridge-like elements. This is the housing block that you're seeing on the right, this tower, and this image that you see here is actually from that housing block. is of that housing block, right? These are the studio box. This is a studio box and a staff room box type of thing that happens here. Another image of the same building. This is the view of the building, that same housing from the housing block side, big kind of green space. Look at the way that the glazing exists, large curtain glazing to bring in light into the inside. And the reason why this entire building is kind of uh, is interesting is because the mode through which it is designed, that you take volumes with different functions and then you assemble them together, literally becomes a mode through which so much design is being taught. Even today at the KRVI, which I completely crazy about, where students make little dabbas of everything and then start saying, I'm putting my this here, I'm putting my that here, and I'm putting my that here, and then connect them together with some strange staircase. So it becomes so deeply embedded that you can take these programmatic volumes and you can assemble these programmatic volumes to make a building. But that's literally what the Bauhaus does, but does it extremely interestingly and very beautifully, actually, because of the just the details of the building. Also, the way that text is used on the surface, no? Text becoming actually a design feature, where typography is also part of design. So everything is part of that design experience of the Bauhaus. This is actually the building entrance. I'll show you the plan so it becomes a little clearer. The way that you come into the Bauhaus, so the main sort of kind of how should I put it, the city type of thing is far away. You come from the street, you enter below a bridge. It's bridge above. You enter from below a bridge. You have two entrances that are actually opposite each other. One is the primary academic block. The other one is a studio block. You have the housing on the other side. And what happens is that you come inside here, and then once you go up, the bridge then connects across at the upper level, connects the two different programs. These are the sections that you can see of the bridge actually through the from the other side actually. This is an axonometric of the building. This is the housing block. There you saw the photograph of people kind of playing around in the roof. Look at the clean white kind of cuboid, the thin sort of ways in which the cornice of the building has kind of almost become only a line. The way that the building doesn't necessarily completely meet the ground. You have this kind of gray basement block with completely different windows. So the building gives the effect of floating, as if it has no gravity, as if everything is kind of in this is a cuboid in air. Okay, this is more images. This is the entrance. So you come inside here from the bridge. This is the bridge block across. You take a left or a right to get inside the academic kinds of buildings. I just have lots of images because I just put them there. So we'll just go through some of these images that you can see. This glazing is really beautiful. It literally floats like a fabric across the entire surface. The structure is at the back. As you can see, the glazing spans across slabs. It's in a climate like in Germany, this is really excellent because it does get rather gray and sometimes you really do require a lot of light and heat. I'm not certain it would work very well in India.
I had a friend who studied at the Bauhaus,
Oh yeah,
and he was saying that all I remember is the perpetual snow everywhere around, you know,
yeah,
and it is very cold.
very cold. Yeah. These are some interior views of the studio spaces. Those are those walls that you're seeing on the outside. Uh, the bridge that connects the two levels. This is the corridor that connects the units. This is the staircase, and you can see the use of color, the gray, white, and red. Very kind of carefully done in certain places. I tried to recreate the Moholy Nagi photo. I just needed somebody jumping off the balcony. But what's really important over here were the workshops. Now, this idea that one needs to work with one's hands, make things with one's hands, so that one is able to kind of create objects that can be used by people. The relationship between craft and industry was to be married in the space of the workshop, pretty much like how we have, right? Look at the ceramics workshop on the right side, for example, or the metalworking workshop on the left. Huh? That's a really important legacy also for us as teachers of architecture today. But of course, the Bauhaus had absolutely every kind of department that you can imagine. These are all the departments within that. Look at it: murals, advertising, weaving, stained glass, pottery, metalwork, fine art, photography, bookbinding, typography, woodwork, theater. It had every bloody thing within it. Huh? And that's really kind of how architecture was imagined. Architecture was not imagined as like a specialized field, but was imagined as a field that collected all these different disciplines together, that would become a place for all these disciplines and all these specialists to work with each other. And that was the imagination of the Bauhaus. So all these people who were working in the Bauhaus also needed places to live. So these Gropius designed a series of 5 or 6 masters houses on a street very close to the main Bauhaus building. I'll just show you some of them. They're really tiny little buildings, all laid in one line. This is Gropius standing in front of his own house. But they're really like these, one, two, three, four, all these cuboidal sorts of buildings. One for Maholi Nagi, etc. That that all lived here. These are images of Kandinsky's wife in front of the house that Kandinsky lived in. But a lot of them were demolished later on. They were destroyed probably in the war. And so these are the buildings as they are today. They are all used as residencies for artists, museum little pieces. Nobody really lives there anymore. But these are the images themselves. And I love these images that kind of reduce the whole of the architecture to just pure planes. Planes and surfaces of different color, not even texture, not even material. It's as if all materiality has disintegrated until all you get is pure volume. It reminded me a little bit of the way that what's his name, Adolf Loos spoke about the Raum plan, the plan of pure volume rather than the free plan. These are the images of the spaces, the colors and the black and the red. Actually, in many ways, these are places that have a profusion of colors. If you go in there, this, for example, is the is a cabinet which is in light green, yellow, blue, green. Look at the ceiling, red, yellow, the railings. Some more images of the homes. So the houses that were demolished have been rebuilt, but they've been rebuilt not to recreate them, but they've been rebuilt as pure volumetric expressions of what the houses once might have been. So what you have here is, this, for example, is the newer edition that is abstracted into complete diagram, where the concrete is being used so that it looks like pure surface, where all the articulation that exists in the details of Gropius have completely been removed. So you know that it's a newer part of the building. Most dramatically is in this one, where it just looks like a piece of sculpture really that exists both from the outside and on the inside. This completely three-dimensional sense that one gets of the internal volume. Yeah. So in this period also, there was one house that was built that continues to exist, that in many ways represented the ideal way of living for the Bauhaus. It's called the House Amhorn. It was built for kind of one of these exhibitions that continues to exist. It is supposed to be the first building that is really built on Bauhaus principles. So which is why I thought it just would be interesting for us to take a look at it. It's a very simple building. It's got a very simple kind of courtyard. You can see it here. All that you're seeing in red are the main permanent walls, and all that you're seeing in blue are openings. So you have this idea of a simple courtyard building, central courtyard also covered with come in on the axis, go to the sides. It's a very simple kind of plan. The section's also very simple. You have a clear story on this for the central space and a veranda on all sides. It literally is like the bungalow type. That's what this is. Interior views that are really celebrating the modern design that's also happening in at the Bauhaus. So even the architecture, even the furniture, the details are all kind of Bauhaus details. So these chairs by Marcel Breuer, for example, these light fittings are all part of the Bauhaus's family. These are contemporary interior images, and I just thought that this is an interesting kind of image of the house, where the idea that the house becomes a place for sexual freedom and for domesticity just seems to kind of be expressed in that image. This is the kitchen space. And, for us, a lot of these may seem very ordinary today, but at that time you have to imagine the creation of this particular kind of architectural language that then becomes so influential to the way that even our apartments today continue to be there. And of course, very, very influential about the Bauhaus are people like Marcel Breuer, whose furniture then becomes very, I guess, if you watch so many films that are looking at modern eras, you'll see so much of this furniture within it, especially this one, which is called the Vasily chair. I guess it's named after Kandinsky. The chess set, this is Mies van der Rohe. He starts designing furniture as well. And you can see kind of the clean, minimal lines and the form, I guess, of the building itself, of the object itself. This is a tea infuser by Marian Brand. All these are really famous objects. All of these were really imagined for mass consumption. But of course, they never really happened for mass consumption. They ended up becoming highly crafted objects that even now are very, very unaffordable for many of us. I went to the Bauhaus store thinking I'll buy me a kind of nice Bauhaus object, and I left with like little postcards that I could get for €1 or some shit like that because I couldn't afford anything else. Yeah. But now we move to the third phase of the Bauhaus. I'm sorry, my nose is watering. I just come in 2 minutes. Not able to speak clearly. I'm getting allergic to something right now. Anyway, so the next phase is when is when Gropius, actually Walter Gropius was the principal or the director of the school until 1928. At which point he decided to step back, and a person called Hans Mayer became director. Hannes Mayer was a kind of communist, and he was really thought that all of this kind of fancy design stuff that um, the Bauhaus was doing needed to be made so that the workers can genuinely benefit. So he moved, like it's written here, he moved away from artistic intuition towards building theory. He separated the sciences from the arts. He said कि science ये होता है, art वो होता है. Okay, technology होता है, humanities होता है. इन दोनों के बीच में कुछ नहीं होता. He organized workshops, he reorganized workshops, he made industry. He like literally said that he wanted to reduce the influence of the artist and start making the Bauhaus really useful to people. I want to produce buildings, I want to produce architects who can contribute to making housing for the great masses who otherwise don't have housing. And one important person who came to prominence in this phase is this one on the right, who's called Ludwig Hilberseimer. Now, Ludwig Hilberseimer was a German architect, and we'll see some of his work later on. He was completely interested in this idea of radical functional architecture. Hilberseimer later on in his career moves to IIT Chicago with Mies van der Rohe, and teaches architecture there for many, many years. Mayer, meanwhile, is also look at his architecture itself. His architecture is really saying that we don't need to do anything fancy. All we need to do is functional stuff, because it's own like forget form follows function. Function is function. There is no functionality is the central feature of all architecture. That's what he believed in. So what happens here is that he literally kind of says this in 1928. He says that dekho, life can be divided into sex life, sleeping habits, pets, gardening, personal hygiene, weather protection, hygiene in the home, like these 12 different things. These are the only motives when building a house. We examine the daily routine of everyone who lives in a house and gives us a functional diagram. The functional diagram and the economic program are the determining principles of the building project. So the reduction of everything on life to merely the purely functional. This is he's like one of those like high end like I guess he really wasn't particularly fond of all these artists who are doing their thing in the Bauhaus. They were like, "Ye sab phaltugiri kya hai? Let's make things useful." And he, of course, then goes ahead and is part of the first Siam conference, which we'll see later on. Later on, what happens to Mayer is that Mayer then moves kind of to Russia, hoping that he'll be then part of that great building project there. Unfortunately, that is also a massive failure for him, because he is seen as an outsider, and then he just moves to Switzerland and chills over there, I guess, for a while. I don't know what happens to him after that, really. But he's not particularly successful even in a supposedly communist country later on. Yeah. The other character, of course, is Hilberseimer that we spoke of a little earlier. And what Hilberseimer is also a complete rationalist, and naturally that's why Hans Mayer liked him. This is a book that he comes up with, which is called Principles of Planning. And in this book, you can see the sort of way in which the cities are now imagined as purely like copy pasted objects. एक बिल्डिंग डिजाइन कर दिया, उसके बाद रैशनल प्लानिंग प्रिंसिपल्स आ गया, ग्रिड मार दिया, रास्ता मार दिया, उसके बाद धार धार धार. You can keep kind of making these forever. You can see the scale of these large clover leaves and building. So if you thought Corbusier's kinds of plans were atrocious, this guy's plans were absolutely amazing. This is like so. Separation of pedestrian and human, pedestrian upar, vehicles niche, big fat commercial building below, these dabba like buildings that are all residential buildings. And as you can see, the residential buildings have absolutely no ornament at all. They are dabba. The beauty of them is supposed to be in their crystalline dabbaness, not much more than that. More drawings by Hilberseimer, fabulous drawings. Looks like a sort of George Orwellian nightmare. Uh, and this is his plan for Berlin. But this is Berlin and the kind of main street here. I think somewhere around here will be the famous Museum Island. But an entire area is erased, and you have these slabs that are racing along from one end to the other. Uh, More slabs that are there. And this was what was also being taught in the studio. So this was literally being taught in the studio, where this was imagined to be the ideal way in which kind of architecture needs to be taught. Hilberseimer, by the way, then moves to America. He teaches people there who then come and teach in India. So just say. You have here, for example, these long. This is all student work that exists in the studio. You also have at this time this entire idea of what light and ventilation being the central idea of housing. These are drawings made by Walter Gropius at the 1930 CM, where he was really saying that height and width ratios, how high a building should go, so that one is able to get light and ventilation. So everything is reduced down to a mathematical and a scientific point of view. So what the Bauhaus seems to do in the first phase, which is this idea of the pure kind of freedom of art and autonomy of art, it also in many ways is part of this entire exercise that really creates a technocratic imagination for what good architecture is. And for us in India, we actually absorb both of these indirectly. And then that becomes really part of the way that architecture begins to be taught in JJ School of Architecture, in the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi and other such spaces. The last phase of the Bauhaus is when Hans Mayer is fired from the Bauhaus for being too political. Okay, because the Bauhaus is now becoming a place where anti-national people are collecting together, like I guess JNU is imagined to be right now. So Hans Mayer is then fired from the Bauhaus, and in his place, a middling kind of a guy who's able to kind of manage all of these mad people, who's not really interested in the political, is more interested in the making of buildings. I'm a pure craftsman. I can work for any ideology. Mies van der Rohe is brought as the next director. Okay. Mies van der Rohe literally is director for like 3 years, from 1930 to 1933, where he says things like, okay, I do not want marmalade, not workshop. I want only a school and only a school. So he literally says that let's remove everything, but just keep the school. A school is a place only for school, so we should not get involved with anything else. And what we are training people to do is make objects. His aim was not social efficiency, but the highest aesthetic and constructive quality. The art of building. That's what he's interested in. Okay, that building is an art, and we need to really pay attention to things like that: geometry, structure, construction, detail. And once we do that well, that's all a school needs to do. A school, in many ways, should not have any ideology at all.
We'll see that. This is also the time when Hitler is already starting to gain power, and the party is actually coming hard on the Bauhaus to. Yeah. Actually, they want to shut it down, frankly speaking. So that's why this idea that no, we are not a place of ideology. We are just a small school. So it was his last effort to keep the Bauhaus alive in many ways.
Yeah. So these are, for example, images that were happening at that time, where what was happening is that Hitler's new regime thinks that the Bauhaus and places like that are places of dissent and communists and artists and free thinkers and things like that cannot be tolerated in the new Germany. There are also places where Jews are there, and these Jews, etc., are anyway corrupting people. So we need to get rid of the Bauhaus. There's a collage made in 1932, which is called The Attack on the Bauhaus. And here you're able to see the way that the Bauhaus building itself is kind of deconstructed, so that the Nazis are literally marching on, I guess, the prone bodies of people on the floor. And here you're able to see what happens to the Bauhaus building, because the Bauhaus then gives up its campus in Dessau and then moves to a building in Berlin, which was being used for the Bauhaus for a while. And this building, which was the original building, started being used as a school for the training of ministers for the Nazi regime in 1935. What happens in 1937 is that an exhibition is held, which we'll see a few lectures later, which is called the Degenerate Art Exhibition in 1937. And this exhibition really is a marker, because what it's held by the German government to show what is horrible about all this avant-garde art. So it's literally saying कि ये देखो ये गंदे लोग कितनी गंदे गंदे चीज करते हैं. We need to get rid of all of them because Hitler is not interested in the avant-garde. Hitler is interested in an architecture of power, not necessarily of freedom. So at this stage, actually, the persecution of people who are artists, who are Jewish, who are free thinkers begins to become really difficult for anybody to survive in Germany, and they all begin to leave. And what you have in this time is that you have a great number of exiles who all leave Germany and go around the world. So, for example, you have in 1934, Walter Gropius leaves Germany. 1933 is when Hitler comes to power, and he goes to Harvard University. Okay. Mies van der Rohe leaves for the US. Walter Gropius, of course, goes to the US. Hans Mayer, like I said earlier, goes to Russia and then Switzerland. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy goes to USA. Marcel Breuer, Herbert Bayer, George Grosz, all of the Schoenberg, this is by not Schoenberg, Einstein, Mendelssohn, all these incredible minds who are all in Germany at that time, all completely leave Germany and find employment and find a way to kind of continue their work elsewhere. And with that exile, they also bring the ideas that they grew up with to all these other places, to the United States and to Russia, deeply affecting the developments there. And in the post-war period, with Russia and the United States becoming extremely powerful world players, their ideas also begin to affect all of us in the rest of the world. I think that's the end of the lecture for today.
Yeah, it's nice. I'm actually, Rohan, curious to see what the NID school kind of curriculum and its similarities with the Bauhaus, because I think the NID was also conceived as this place where, sorry, but the students should take the take the charge. Yeah.
Anyone has any clarifications, questions, comments?
Neha, Shivali.
Yeah, so I have few comments under doubt. So first was that those photo montages that you showed, they were crazy, and then those pictures of people from the balcony, and then the shot, it was taken dynamically, and then how we related it to the horizon, and then the building itself being the sky, they were crazy. And then you showed us one picture of the chess set by the Bauhaus by Joseph. I don't remember his surname. I follow woodworking very closely. I mean, I love woodworking, and I have literally 10 to 15 pins saved on my phone, resembling the same kind of chess. I thought it was very contemporary in its today's generation, but then seeing all this, it already happened in 1920s. It was very interesting. And then one more thing, I kind of missed that part where we compared the sulfuric acid factory and the Vegas factory with the Apollo's desire for light, and then his desire, and the other one's for desire for darkness. Where the I mean that was that an article or something, because I kind of, that slide went too quickly, or either my connection was poor. I want to know that, and then how and after that we saw a few slides where we saw the facade of the Bauhaus building, where we saw those huge glass glazings where we could see through the slabs. Is that also related to the Pegasus factory, where we saw the glass glazings with the even where we couldn't see the column at the corners?
Yeah, I think yes. I think I'll begin with the end. I think I think you're right. I think what happens with the Bauhaus building is that Gropius has actually played around with the idea of the glass skin. If you think about last week, and you remember Bruno Taut's obsession with glass, the 1914 Oxford exhibition of the glass pavilion. There is a certain way in which glass is really being seen at that time as a modern material that allows transparency, and modern men don't need to be afraid of nature. We can be in nature, we can be naked in nature, and all of that kind of imagination. So I think glass itself as a material that has the impression of freedom becomes embedded in the work of a lot of the modern architects, and we continue to see that even today. Before that, I think the idea of the Apollo and Dionysian, I think that was a connection I made. Actually, it's not a connection that is written, but I think you can find the book itself in The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. he's the one who's written a book that really talks about the difference between the Apollonian way of thinking and the Dionysian way of thinking, and that the dynamic that exists between these two. What I did was I took that idea, I stole that idea, and I played around with these two factories because they happen to be built at the same time in Germany. So that's what happened. And yeah, I think what the Bauhaus has done is it has created an incredible visual language. So, I mean, I could only show you some works by some people, but if you look at the range of people who worked with the Bauhaus in fabric, in typography, in everything, you'll realize that so much of what we are doing today, just in terms of the visuality of it, the way that the way that we work with materials, the way that us are so highly dependent on that particular period of time. And of course, they were not original in some sense. They also emerged out of the networks of many different sorts of people from Russia, Germany, and Netherlands, America. They all happened to come together to create a sort of alchemy within which all these sorts of ideas were made possible. So yeah, I would recommend actually that you look at much more of Moholy Nagi's photo montages that are there. They're all available online. There are great books on the Bauhaus that are there everywhere. It's really, really interesting.
If you, yeah, that's an interesting point that you mentioned. The Felix factory is built in, I think, 1911 or 1913. Okay, the Bauhaus building is built much later. Okay, I think in 19, Ron, correct me, 1924 or 25 is when the Bauhaus.
24 to 27 or something like that. Yeah, some date
24,
like
yeah, somewhere around there the building is. And in many ways, the Vegas factory is where the first experiments of that kind of curtain kind of handling were done by Gropius. Okay. Also, if you look at the Bauhaus building, it shares so many similarities to that factory building. Okay, the imagination is that this is actually a place of production. Okay, that this is this kind of, that factory is the school. Okay, factory and its components and its kind of ancillary sort of parts are actually the school. Okay, that itself is a very revolutionary idea in at that time, you know. So this is the big turn that is actually happening in terms of, because all production actually is increasingly becoming this industrial kind of mode. It's increasingly getting into that mode of production, and in many ways Bauhaus kind of ideology feels that there is a role for the academy also over there, you know. I mean, that's my that's my kind of reading of it. Yeah.
Ambika has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the Eames India report, right? Now that's an important thing because, later on in these lectures, we will be going to America, and because Charles and Ray Eames were then called to put together the India report. And in the story that I seem to have I'm trying to make is actually I'm looking at the influence of Mies after he goes to America on people like Charles and Ray Eames.
Yeah.
So it's possible that Charles and Ray Eames bring certain kind of Bauhausian imaginations through, I think, the Black Mountain College is where they studied. And if I'm not wrong, the Black Mountain College was also a place where a lot of the people from Bauhaus did go and teach. So I think there may be, whether that's directly a 1:1 correspondence, I'm not certain. But I think that there might be that influence that then finds its way into the Eames report. Yeah, I would say yes, actually, that there is an influence for certain.
Yeah.
Indianized, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually quite fascinated because I've seen the NID building very closely. Okay, and I've seen the kind of workshops they had and some of the programs that they had, where there was a lot of cross kind of learning and between the different kind of disciplines that are there. And I went to in the Netherlands. I went to another school which is the Eindhoven Super School, Eindhoven Academy, which is actually now inside a Philips factory. Okay, where the program is exactly the same. The first year is not a year where you decide what you are going to do. The first year is where everybody is together, and you are only exploring your different materials and different kind of ideas. Okay, and it is only in the later years that you actually branch out into specializations in that sense. Okay, many of the European programs actually operate like that, I've noticed. Yeah.
it's important to imagine that this is a completely new way of imagining architecture. Right?
Yeah.
Than the earlier one. It's important to kind of recognize that earlier the idea of the Beaux-Arts, etc., was to look at architecture quite differently. Where you learn typologies, where you learn certain kinds of organizational geometries and stuff like that. Well, this makes it something else. It's a radical transformation.
But one thing is sure with some of the experiments that these guys did is that the question of the problem of cities was brought in during this period towards the end of the Bauhaus, the state of the cities, if you want to call it, so hence those imaginations of kind of horrific kind of blocks of housing, yeah, exactly, and how are we layering the city. So those questions become very, very critical in this period also. Yeah. This one, Yoshita, you're saying something. I completely just hold on. She had written something long was typed, but I can't find it anymore.
Yeah, it's not there anymore.
I don't know how that happens. But...
No, I deleted it. I was in the middle of writing it.
Okay. So say then.
No, I'd rather write it because I'm able to compose it better that way. Just 1 second, it's almost done.
Okay. Who else do we have as a respondent? Yes, this boy.
So actually, I wanted to say, ask, it was very interesting to see that how Bauhaus started with like giving the people of Germany some hope, like equality and power in their structures, like everyone having the same kind of it, and how it went downwards, like and in the end, where Hitler was wanted to curb the Bauhaus because as it meant people could practice anything and people could have freedom of what they wanted, but the Nazi party didn't want it. So like it was like how it started with people having hope and it ended with it being curbed. And I also find how Bauhaus is so much relevant right now, like the concepts and the ideology, like in the second phase where the architects went into the workshops and built the small furnitures and chairs and everything by themselves for their own projects so that they could make it as one whole thing. Like even people doing that, like I found people doing that right now also, like Bijoy Jain does all his projects by himself so that he can have his own ideology or type in it completely. Like that concept was very interesting. That was very
Thanks,
like,
man.
yeah.
Thank you.
Akriti has posted a comment. So like Bauhaus during its initial days made some creative furniture made by students and was put for the exhibition in the Haus am Hohn, and this happened like after World War One. So does normal civilian disagree to the idea of this, claiming that it's a waste of money and they should just stick to the idea of low budget housing? Akriti, please explain. Rohan, did you understand what she's saying?
No, I don't know actually. Bauhaus made some creative furniture and was put in an exhibition. And she's saying that was the Bauhaus kind of furniture a waste of money?
Yeah.
I see.
Did people feel it was a waste of money?
Yeah, like because it happened after the First World War One, and there were like exhibition put up in Haus am Hohn, so made done by the students. So like there were normal civilians affected by the World War. So were there like
I don't think students put up the exhibition. I think Marcel Breuer was a teacher at that time, if I'm not wrong. But anyway, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
So was it seen as a waste of money by the people? Is that the question? I don't.
I think like there is a tension there because what was happening is that the Bauhaus was framing itself saying that listen, we are doing things so that we can. These will be cheaper. This will be cheaper. They'll be more accessible to many more people. Good design for the normal man, common man. That is what they wanted to do, no?
Okay.
That's the way that they are pitching their project. But you can imagine that they are kind of pitching this sort of high modernist aesthetic within a country and within a small town in Germany. They sound so tiny, I can't tell you.
Very tiny.
Yeah.
So there was always a tension between your kids who came there, like, kind of doing their cool things, maybe smoking stuff and, like being young and like you guys are cool. And all these kind of old fogies were sitting there saying, "Ye kahan se aaye ye log yaar, ye urban types." There was always that tension that was in the air while the Bauhaus was there, and the director's job very often was to be able to mediate those. But Dessau started also becoming very famous because of the presence of the Bauhaus. So Dessau was also happy in some way to have the Bauhaus within the boundaries of the school. So there was a tension between, but I don't think it was about cost only. Yeah? I think it was more to do with ideology. Uh, Conservatism versus freedom type of thing.
Yeah, because like I read about Horse and Home like in my case study. So like during its initial days, like they started asking question to the Bauhaus like like what are you guys working for and everything. So yeah, because of that.
Right. Awesome. और कोई Yoshita? Yoshita hasn't said anything, no, yet?
No, she has not.
See, we are still waiting for her to compose.
Something has come from Shivali. The radial diagram of courses was very interesting to me. The idea of haptic activities in the courses in the Bauhaus is very interesting. It's something I feel the absence of because of laptops and almost indirect drafting. Yeah. This actually is I don't know. We went through a very different training, Shivali, where it was all hand done. Okay, and there was even at that time a kind of a sort of a movement in the school where I was studying, accept that computers need to come in. I mean, they can actually tremendously help the design kind of exercise. And I don't know. I somehow feel that I use both equally. Okay, so somewhere it is you will develop your own kind of haptic abilities. The school, by the way, you're right. The school has moved in its kind of pedagogic kind of intent in that sense. Increasingly, and I have seen at Kamla Reja also increasingly, the computer has become a very important medium. Rohan, correct me if I'm wrong.
You're right. The computer has more.
And it's some of us who do believe in the hand kind of method are at constant loggerheads with some others who feel that what is the big deal. Ultimately you guys will be working in offices and you will require those software skills, right? So
I think for me it's always like that. I think a skill is just a skill. I think when you're working with different mediums, different ideas of your mind get activated. So I think that is more important. And I think that the computer activates certain parts of the brain and the hand activates other parts of the brain. And I think both are important and both should be treated with respect. What happens is that we tend to be either romantics for the hand or kind of technophiliacs, like, oh yeah, now computer can do everything, why do we need that? I think these are rather naive sorts of positions today. It's important to know where and what one uses what part of one's body for, if you know what I mean. Like, when to use the hand, what kind of training is required, and based on that one should make decisions. Rather than simple generic statements to say that hand is better than computer or computer is better than hand. It makes no sense.
Yoshita has a big no. Rohan.
What's the note? I'm far away from
okay. Oh, sorry. I thought she says I thought it was kind of strange that Hans Meyer, who had such a functional point of view in regards to architecture, became the director for such an influential and avant-garde design school. And then the question is, was the Nazi party against the Bauhaus just because of Gropius's political leanings and him being an internationalist? Just the usual authoritarian outlook of being against anything that's not extremely nationalist, or just because they had Jewish students and teachers?
Both, all of the above.
Yeah. The chess set is very interesting because the pieces are shaped in a way that shows their movement. Like the bishop is cross-shaped and the rook is, plus shaped. I thought that it was very cool. Okay, cool. Okay.
There's a hand up.
Shravan is there now. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, my pressing hand button, my hand raise button wasn't pressing, so I had to do it manually. So I just wrote my questions down. So the turbine factory and Bauhaus have a sort of arch-like form. Is that a purely structural design choice, or was it an homage or a remnant of like old classical architecture where the arch was like a prominent feature?
The Bauhaus building, I don't know if it has an arch. Does the Bauhaus building?
It doesn't. A circular kind of roof, like a semicircular kind of roof. So it's very remnant of an arch.
Semicircular roof on the Bauhaus.
Bauhaus building, I don't. The Vegas factory maybe has a lot of.
The Bauhaus building has a flat roof, yeah.
Flat roof.
Are all flat.
Okay, then I think it's a different. The Bauhaus, my song. Oh, okay, then I think I got it the wrong building. But two of the designs they showed us had like a arch-like structure. Because now confused when I get the Bauhaus in my notes.
Okay.
I think more. See, I think the Vegas factory might have had some remnants of a classical temple sorts, which where the pediment in many ways might be arch, but it also had a structural reason because of the span and the truss. So I would say that I would go with the truss imagination, but because of the hard symmetry, it seems to have remnants of a classical plan, of a classical type, not a plan, a classical type.
Right.
The Bauhaus pretty much is, independent.
Okay.
Also, I have another question. There's hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Michael. Yeah, so there's a lot of emphasis on the lines and the linearity and the silhouettes of a design. Like even in the furniture, you can clearly make out more lines and surfaces in some of the stuff that show, like the chair with them just had like two curved legs instead of the regular four legs. And even the kind of silhouettes are very either like a something that kind of has a certain kind of a you can recognize the shape of it. So was there anything change about drafting or like the representation in plans and sections that kind of gravitated towards this since we're talking about technology and how CAD also influences designs in certain ways, more orthogonal design? Was something similar going on? Because they're very like silhouette based or very line based in the design.
And I think it has to do with the fact that they want to simplify things. Because they think that any kind of ornament, etc., is something that is decorative. So the urge for simplification, the urge for abstraction, leads, if they could make everything into just pure surface, they would. So I think it emerges from that urgency to reduce everything down to its most primary element, both in terms of silhouette as well as in terms of materiality. So every single object also will be usually in a singular material, and the joints between these different materials will be articulated with great care. So there is a sort of attempt towards a cleanliness, and that there is very important. The form itself becomes ornament. In that the form and the silhouette itself becomes iconic of a certain type. I think that's and you have the reduction of everything into pureness, pure form, pure line, pure. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that imagination because it's imagined that the purity and the clarity of mind will lead to a clarity and purity of form. There's a morality also weirdly at the base of it, I think. I think we spoke about that when we were talking about Adolf Loos and his disturbed. He's so disturbed by the kind of strange, odd sexualities that the Vienna Secession seems to presume. That he tends towards a building where ornament is a crime. Gendered, maybe. That's also possible.
Also, a lot of the Bombay apartments, I noticed are this weird, like, in-between space between, like, modernist and, like, a very ornate design. Because you have this idea of, like, the box and a very simple, like, repeatable design.
And I think it's to emerge from the Art Deco movement.
That's the Art Deco. That's the entire. So in the Art Deco, especially in Bombay, if you look at the building in its structural components, it's fairly simple. It's a column beam grid where the outside wall is actually most generally a stone wall that holds the entire ornamentation. Okay, the entire decorative part is actually cast in or whatever, it's sculpted in stone, but inside the building is like a regular RCC building with the ability to have large floors also, you know. And you find a lot of these buildings in Bombay, especially if you are around DN Road.
I was talking about the more suburban styles, like I think it came out of like the urgency of apartment buildings, like the rush to build more apartments and middle class and low income housing.
Buildings built in the 60s and the 70s.
Buildings in the 60s and the 70s in the suburbs. So your like your housing colonies and things like that. I live in a building which is built in the 60s in Mahim, and I mean it's your typical RCC frame construction with brick and fill walls, you know, no ornamentation at all. There is no ornamentation.
But you still have this kind of chhajjas kind of having some sort of ornament, and then this certain idea of the grills having that ornament, which was added later on.
No, the period that Sean you're referring is before the 60s and the 70s. Okay, you're referring to
like these buildings were designed as a pure box, as like a pure shell, and then like over time we've seen these additions of ornamentation build up because like residents living there and the collective choice of building and renovation. You see like the kind of grills are more ornate suddenly as compared to the rest of the building.
What's interesting about the Bauhaus is actually what happens now is after Gropius goes to America, and Gropius then becomes the teacher of, we'll see their work also a little later on, becomes the teacher of Achyut Kanvinde and Habib Rahman.
Habib Rahman, yeah.
Architects from India who go and study under Gropius. In the 30s and the 40s, they come back to India and become part of the Delhi government. Habib Rahman becomes part of the Delhi governments and builds many buildings in Delhi, which are
he becomes part of the Public Works Department, right?
Yes, he becomes part of the PWD.
Yeah.
While Kanvinde comes back and becomes an architect who does a lot of work for the government in that big nation building period. And in those buildings, you're able to see the influence of the Bauhaus. And I think the School of Planning and Architecture is also established in Delhi at that time. So modes of teaching architecture also are highly influenced by that turn. And then that, of course, are the architects who've designed all our state buildings that you're seeing across the country, you know, the RCC frames and even the housing colonies, Shravan, that you're referring to, maybe they all are built by that with that imagination and that aesthetic.
Right. So just the idea of the localization of the Bauhaus has turned into like...
So the Bauhaus, I mean, has been very, very influential across, and of course it takes on different forms at different places. Yeah.
Of course, in India, we cannot the influence that Chandigarh and the entire kind of architecture that it brings is phenomenal. Yeah. But I mean, in many ways, it's an extension of that same way of constructing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We will be doing an India Modern. I think the last lecture of this series is looking at Habib Rahman and Kanvinde at the end. So we'll get there. Okay. Any other questions? Any other questions, or should we end for today? And next week, what are we doing? We are going to Russia. No, is that somebody's? Shirish, you're on mute.
Somebody's raised their hand and then they put it down. Ria?
Yeah, hi. I actually wanted to comment about the house I'm on in Weimar, which was the first Bauhaus house which was built. So when I had read about it, I noticed that each room was basically designed for the user was very user specific. So the person who was going to use it, it was designed only for that person. So I found it very interesting that since Rohan mentioned that it was a typical Bauhaus style, that these different geometric figures come together to form, with having different functions come together to form a whole structure. So what I had noticed about this particular house was that it was a prototype. If you see in plan, it is like these different functions which are just dedicated to those particular users coming together to form just like one single square. But then if you see it in plan, these are like different sizes of squares and rectangles coming together to form the plan. So I thought that was really interesting. And also I found that it was a prototype for all the other Bauhaus, like the future Bauhaus buildings, where the point which he mentioned, like the cornice, which is very sleek, basically defines the the height and the structure. So that is also noticed in the house I'm on, is what I wanted to say.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Should we kind of end class now? Maybe we can then pick up next time. I think the Soviet avant-garde, which I will try and finish in one class. If it doesn't happen, we'll do it in two. It's quite a lot of stuff that's there. Then
Rohan, Ambika is asking about Golconda, and I'm saying that Golconda needs an entire session.
Yeah. No, I don't know. So I don't think so. Actually, I don't think
it's not.
Golconda can be easily. No, I don't think so. It's got a different everything actually.
Everything, yeah. Okay.
Maybe closer to Corbusier than it is to the Bauhaus.
But not really, Rohan, because I mean the entire process of construction, the way the finance, everything is so different in that project, and the life and the amount of time that they took, how material was procured, everything is different. It's not a project that is in this kind of nationalist, large scale kind of mode at all. So anyways, I mean that's just me, but we can create correlations in terms of the aesthetic sensibilities, somewhere, but maybe. Okay. Thanks, Riya. Thanks for those comments. See you guys. Yeah. I'm stopping the downloading. I don't know. Jin, were you able to take the attendance? One attendance ka kya karenge? Jin they will have to pull it out of the recording or something.
I can't take over.
No, we can't take. I saw.